10 forgotten survival meals from Wwii Japan that kept families alive. In the summer of 1944, a schoolteacher named Fumio in Osaka wrote 3 words in his diary that said more about the state of Japan than any military communique issued that year. He wrote, "The rice is gone. Not low. Not rationed. Gone." The imperial government had been diverting food from the civilian population to the military since 1941. By 1944, the diversion had become a hemorrhage. The official daily caloric ration in major Japanese cities had dropped to roughly 1,200 calories, below the threshold at which the human body begins consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. The black market that filled the gap between official ration and actual need consumed most of a working family's monthly income for a fraction of what the money should have bought. Children were being sent to rural areas not for safety from the bombing alone, but because the countryside still had food and the cities increasingly did not. And yet families ate. Every evening in kitchens that had sometimes lost their roofs and sometimes lost their gas supply, and sometimes lost everything except the clay pot and the determination of the woman standing over it, families ate. The meals were not what anyone would have chosen. Several of them were not what anyone had previously considered food. All of them were the product of a specific kind of intelligence that deprivation develops in people who refuse to stop feeding the people they love, an intelligence that looked at what existed and asked not what can I make, but what must I make this into. Number 8 on this list was made from a plant that grew in bombed lots and city parks that most people had walked past their entire lives without knowing it was edible. Number 5 was technically constructed from industrial material that the government repurposed as a food source when conventional food sources failed. Number 2 required a fermentation technique that mothers performed in hiding because the smell, if detected by neighbors, risked reporting to the neighborhood food committee. These 10 meals kept Japanese families alive during the worst years of the Pacific War. They are not in any cookbook. They are not taught in any culinary school. They exist in the memories of people who are now very old, in the diaries of people who did not survive to become very old, and in the hands of a few grandmothers who still make them occasionally, not from necessity, but from the particular loyalty that people feel toward the things that saved them when nothing else could. Number 10, zosui, stretched rice gruel. Begin here because this is where every wartime Japanese family's family began, with the recognition that the rice they had was less than the rice they needed, and that the distance between those two quantities had to be closed by water and patience, rather than by any additional ingredient they could not obtain. Zosui in peacetime was a pleasant cold weather dish, leftover rice simmered in broth with vegetables and egg, a comfortable bowl that required little effort and produced reliable satisfaction. Wartime zosui was a different calculation entirely. A family's weekly rice ration, distributed through the neighborhood association in carefully weighed portions that decreased as the war progressed, was insufficient to feed the household at normal rice density for 7 days. Simmered in 4 to 6 times its volume of water, the same rice became gruel that occupied a bowl convincingly, produced warmth, delivered the starch calories the body required, and extended across 2 or 3 more meals than the same rice cooked normally would have allowed. The additions varied with what the Wwii had provided and what the neighborhood black market had made available at prices the family could afford. A dried sardine crumbled into the water. A leaf of whatever green had survived in the small garden plot. A piece of sweet potato from the emergency ration, a scrap of daikon. In the worst months, the final year of the war, when the American bombing campaign had reduced supply chains to chaos and the official ration had become a theoretical rather than a practical document, the gruel contained nothing beyond the rice and the water, and whatever the cook had managed to forage from public spaces that had once been parks and were now informally community gardens of desperation. Diaries from Japanese civilians across multiple cities describe zosui with a consistency that has the quality of shared testimony. The smell of the gruel heating in the morning. The sound of the pot on the burner, a sound that meant the family was still eating, still together, still managing the distance between what existed and what was needed. The smell and the sound together constituted a form of comfort that the gruel's modest contents could not fully explain, and that the people who experienced it never forgot. Number 9. Imo Gayu, sweet potato gruel. By 1943, sweet potato had become the primary caloric supplement to the diminishing rice ration in most Japanese households, promoted aggressively by the government's Food Management Bureau as a patriotic substitute for rice, and planted by civilian families in every available patch of earth: backyard gardens, rooftop plots, the verges of railway lines, the edges of schoolyards from which the iron fencing had already been removed and donated to weapons manufacturing. Imo gayu, sweet potato ground or mashed into a porridge, extended with water into a gruel of similar consistency to rice zosui, provided calories from the potato's starch and a sweetness from its natural sugars that plain rice gruel entirely lacked. In households with children, this sweetness was significant. Children who refused the tasteless stretch of thin rice gruel would eat imo gayu. The sweetness made the difference between a child who consumed adequate calories and a child who did not, and in 1944, that difference had consequences that parents understood with a clarity that peacetime parents rarely need. The government distributed sweet potato cultivation guidance through neighborhood associations, women's organizations, and school programs with the organizational thoroughness of a military operation, which it was. The home front food supply being understood by 1943 as a strategic matter rather than a domestic one. Families who had never grown anything were instructed in planting techniques. Urban women who had spent their lives in apartments were digging soil in parks that the municipal government had designated for food production. The sweet potato that went into the morning gruel had often been planted by the woman who cooked it in ground she had broken herself with tools she had never previously held. The labor involved in producing the food that kept the family alive was, in this context, inseparable from the food itself. Imo gayu tasted of sweet potato and water, and the specific effort of people who had no other options and made the available option work. Number 8. Yomogi mochi, mugwort rice cake. In the bombed lots and overgrown parks and neglected roadside strips of wartime Japanese cities, a plant grew that most urban residents had spent their entire lives walking past without knowing its name or its edibility. Yomogi, Japanese mugwort, is a perennial herb with serrated leaves, slightly downy on their undersides, smelling faintly of the wild, bitter and aromatic, and completely free to anyone who knew what to look for and where to look for it. Rural Japanese had always known yomogi as a spring vegetable and a traditional ingredient in seasonal mochi. Urban Japanese, whose food knowledge was calibrated to markets rather than fields, learned it during the war from government pamphlets, neighborhood association bulletins, and the accumulated advice of older residents whose rural origins gave them botanical knowledge that the urban-born younger generation had never acquired. The pamphlets listed wild, edible plants available in city environments. Yomogi was at the top of every list because it grew almost everywhere that human disturbance had broken ground. Yomogi leaves blanched, squeezed dry, and pounded into rice gruel or whatever starch base was available, produced a green-tinted cake with a faint bitterness and a wild, herbal fragrance that made it taste like something specific and deliberate rather than merely like the starch it was built from. The leaves contributed iron, calcium, vitamin K, and chlorophyll that the starch and water diets of urban wartime families were chronically short of. A handful of yomogi gathered from a bombed lot made the family's starch ration nutritionally more complete than it had any right to be. Mothers who gathered yomogi described the activity as one of the few moments during the war when they felt actively resourceful rather than merely enduring. The city had been damaged into wildness, and the wildness had provided something useful. This inversion, the bomb damage that created the space in which the nutritional supplement grew, was not irony to the women gathering it. It was simply the logic of survival, which finds its materials wherever the materials happen to be. Number 7. Soybean dregs rice, okara meshi. The tofu shops that continued operating through the early war years produced okara as an unavoidable byproduct of every batch of tofu pressed, the white, fibrous, protein-containing pulp remaining after the soy milk had been extracted and set. In normal times, okara was sold cheaply as animal feed or given away to customers who knew what to do with it. In wartime, it became a food in its own right, mixed directly into rice or rice gruel in proportions that increased as rice supplies decreased, bulking the household's starch ration with plant protein and fiber that made the smaller portions of rice more nutritionally complete than the larger portions they were replacing. Okara meshi, okara mixed through cooked rice, had a different texture from pure rice, slightly grainy, less glossy, with a faint beany taste that was not unpleasant but was unmistakably present and unmistakably not rice. For families accustomed to polished white rice as their daily staple, okara meshi was a visible reminder of what had changed. Children noticed. Some refused initially. The refusal did not persist when the alternative was less food. Nutritionally, the substitution was accidentally beneficial in ways that no one involved recognized at the time. Okara added fiber to diets that were developing the deficiency diseases that polished white rice-dominant eating produces over time. It added plant protein at a moment when animal protein had become effectively unobtainable. It added the cellular material of soybeans, the part that the pressing process had separated from the more valued liquid, in a form that the bodies eating it could use. The tofu shops gave away what the tofu-making process had left over. The families mixed it into their diminished rice. The result was worse than what they had eaten before the war and better, in specific measurable ways, than pure rice gruel would have been. Number 6, acorn and chestnut porridge, donguri kayu. In the forested mountains surrounding Japanese cities, autumn produced a harvest that had been largely irrelevant to the food supply of an industrialized society with functioning markets and adequate distribution. By 1944, the distribution had broken, and the markets had emptied, and the mountains became a food source for the first time in generations. Acorns, donguri, required processing before they were edible. The tannins that made them bitter and mildly toxic in raw form had to be leached out through repeated soaking in water, changed daily over several days, or through boiling in multiple changes of water, or through burial in the ground for extended periods, a traditional preservation technique that rural Japanese communities had maintained in practice, and urban Japanese were rediscovering from written records and the advice of rural relatives. Processed acorns were dried and ground into a flour or meal that could be simmered into porridge or mixed into rice gruel to extend the starch. Chestnuts required less processing but more effort to obtain in quantity. Families traveled to forest edges on weekends or sent children who could travel without it attracting attention to gather what the trees had dropped. The chestnuts were dried, stored, and rationed through the winter in quantities that supplemented but could not replace the official food ration. Donguri kayu, acorn porridge, tasted of the earth in a way that processed food never does, with a faint astringency that the soaking reduced but did not eliminate, and a density that came from the fat content of the nut rather than from carbohydrate starch. For city families eating it for the first time, it tasted of the forest, of a world outside the bombed city that was still producing food regardless of what human politics had done to the world inside it. This was not a small thing. The taste of something that had grown without human management in a year when human management had produced catastrophe carried a comfort that the porridge's modest nutrition does not fully account for. First pattern break. Here's the thing about wartime Japanese food that the histories of the period mention briefly and then move past in favor of the political and military narrative. The burden of feeding the family under these conditions fell almost entirely on women. The men were at the front, or in the factories working 12-hour shifts for the war industry, or in the neighborhood civil defense organizations performing the administrative duties of a society organizing itself against attack. The women were in the kitchens, or rather in the ruins of kitchens, or in the spaces where kitchens had been before the bombing, managing food supplies that were insufficient by design, producing meals from materials that required knowledge, creativity, and physical labor that the pre-war domestic role had not prepared them for. They gathered wild plants from bomb sites and parks. They processed acorns over multiple days of water changing. They maintained fermentation crocks through conditions that disrupted temperature and supply. They stretched rice into gruel and gruel into meals and meals into the next day with an arithmetic of scarcity that consumed significant mental energy alongside the physical effort of the cooking itself. The meals on this list are the products of that intelligence and that labor. They are not celebrated in the histories because they were domestic, and domestic work in the historical record is consistently undervalued relative to its actual contribution to survival. But the families that lived through the war years in Japanese cities survived not because of military strategy or political decision or any of the things that fill the history books. They survived because women stood over clay pots in damaged kitchens and made food from what existed. That is the history that the meals on this list contain. Number 5, chlorella and seaweed paste, Midori no Tabemono. In 1944, the Japanese government's Food Management Bureau issued guidance that belongs in the category of things that reveal how desperate the situation had become by the measure of what was being officially recommended. The guidance promoted the consumption of chlorella, a single-celled green algae cultivable in tanks, rooftop containers, and any vessel that could hold water and receive sunlight, as a protein and nutrient supplement for civilian populations whose conventional protein sources had been effectively eliminated. Chlorella cultivation was promoted through neighborhood associations, women's organizations, and school science programs. Tanks and trays appeared on rooftops and in courtyards of urban apartment buildings. The green sludge harvested from them was dried into a paste or powder and mixed into gruel, added to whatever soup was being made, stirred into the rice at serving. The taste was aggressively mineral and green, the taste of concentrated algae, which is to say the taste of something alive that has been concentrated past the point where its aliveness is subtle. Seaweed, wakame, hijiki, kombu, was more palatably incorporated into the same soups and gruels as a mineral and iodine supplement. Dried seaweed lasted indefinitely in storage and could be obtained through coastal trade even when other foods were unavailable. The combination of algae and seaweed in the daily gruel produced a nutritional supplement that genuinely offset some of the deficiency diseases developing in the civilian population from sustained inadequate eating. The people eating Midori no Tabemono, green food, as it was colloquially categorized, were not doing so by preference. They were doing so because the government had correctly identified that the civilian population was developing nutritional deficiencies that would reduce the workforce productivity and civilian morale that the war effort required. The nutritional science and the political calculation arrived at the same meal. The families ate it either way. Number 4, hoshi imo, dried sweet potato strips. Preservation was as important as production during the wartime food crisis. The sweet potato harvest came once a year in autumn. The family that could not preserve the harvest through winter had no sweet potato in February, which in 1944 and 1945 meant no supplemental calories during the months when the official ration was at its most restricted and the body's need for caloric warmth was at its highest. Hoshi imo, sweet potatoes steamed and then sliced into strips and dried in winter sun and cold air until their moisture content dropped low enough for extended storage, were produced in Japanese households and small agricultural operations with the urgency of a strategic material. The drying process concentrated the sweet potato's natural sugars until the strips developed a white crystalline coating of crystallized glucose, the same coating found on hoshigaki dried persimmon, that made them sweet enough to constitute a treat in a domestic economy that had lost access to refined sugar entirely. Women and children spread the sweet potato strips on bamboo trays set on south-facing surfaces during the brief hours of winter sunlight, brought them in at night to prevent moisture reabsorption, returned them to the sun the next morning, monitored the progress of drying by touch and color over the 10 to 14 days the process required. The labor was considerable. The result was a shelf-stable, calorie-dense, naturally sweet food that survived months of storage without refrigeration and provided rapid energy when consumed directly and sustained energy when added to gruel or soup. Hoshi imo are sold commercially in Japan today as a health food, marketed for their natural sweetness, their fiber content, their resistance to refined sugar. Number 3, nuka zuke, Rice bran pickles made in hiding. The rice polishing that produced the white rice, the Japanese diet was built around, also produced nuka, rice bran, in quantities proportional to the amount of rice processed. Nuka was normally used as animal feed or as a mild abrasive cleaning agent. In wartime, two things happened simultaneously. Rice polishing was officially restricted to preserve more of the grain's nutritional content, and the nuka that had always been available as a byproduct became a food in its own right. Nuka zook, vegetables fermented in a bed of rice bran, salt, and water, was practiced in some Japanese households before the war as a traditional preservation method, producing pickles of particular flavor complexity. During the war, it spread widely as a preservation technique for vegetables that were otherwise difficult to store, as a fermentation that produced probiotic cultures that deteriorating diets needed, and as a method of using nuka itself as a nutritional supplement. The vegetables absorbing B vitamins from the bran during fermentation in a transfer that genuinely offset the thiamine deficiency developing in populations eating restricted diets. The hiding referred to in this entry requires explanation. Neighborhood food committees in wartime Japan monitored household food activities with the thoroughness that the rationing system required, and the smell of an active nuka bed, which is powerful and distinctive and unmistakably fermentation, could attract the attention of neighbors or committee members who might report a household for unauthorized food activity. Families managing nuka beds in apartments kept them in back rooms, under floors when possible, in spaces distant from windows. The fermentation was conducted quietly, the pickles removed, and the beds stirred in the early morning before neighbors were active. The paranoia was not irrational. The food regulations were real, and the enforcement was real, and the fermentation bed that kept the family's gut microbiome functional and their vitamin B intake above the threshold for neurological damage was worth the effort of concealment. The nuka pickle that emerged from the bed each morning tasted of fermentation and patience, and the specific bravery of doing necessary things quietly when the situation requires it. Number 2. Kanten ryori, agar dishes that mimicked food that no longer existed. Here is the entry that most completely reveals the creative desperation of wartime Japanese cooking. Kanten, agar-agar, derived from Tengusa red algae, is a setting agent similar in function to gelatin but derived from seaweed rather than from animal collagen. It had been used in Japanese confectionery before the war to set sweets and create the clear, jewel-like wagashi that Japanese dessert culture had built around its unique properties. During the war, kanten became a food extender and a food substitute of remarkable versatility. Set with water and salt and a small amount of whatever flavoring was available, kanten produced a firm gel that could be cut into shapes resembling tofu, molded into forms resembling fish cake, mixed with vegetable liquid, to create something that looked like and approximately tasted of foods that had become unavailable. Kanten tofu, agar set with soy milk or plain water and cut into blocks, delivered almost no protein relative to real tofu, but occupied the visual and textural space of tofu in the bowl, which mattered to families for whom the psychological dimension of eating, the recognition of familiar forms on the table, was as important as the caloric content those forms delivered. Kanten mixed with sweet potato paste and molded into the shapes of traditional sweets was made for children's birthdays in 1944 and 1945 by mothers who understood that the form of celebration mattered even when the substance was entirely changed. The kanten sweet that replaced the red bean confection that the child remembered from before the war was not the same thing. The child knew. The mother knew. The making of it anyway, the refusal to let the war eliminate the form of ordinary life even when its content had been stripped away, was a form of resistance that no military history has found a category for. The agar dishes of wartime Japan are the most honest expression of what the meals on this list were actually about. They were not about nutrition in the narrow sense. They were about the maintenance of a recognizable human life in conditions that were trying very hard to make human life unrecognizable. The clay pot was still on the burner. The family was still at the table. The bowl still contained something. That something, shaped like what it had replaced, said, "We are still here. We still eat like people. We intend to continue doing so." Number 1. Ichiju Isai, one soup, one side, maintained against everything. The meal at number 1 is not a specific dish. It is a structure. The same structure that samurai philosophers had prescribed as moral discipline, that post-war families had maintained through scarcity, that elderly people living alone had used to answer the question of whether cooking for one was worth the effort. During the war years, Ichiju Isai became something it had never previously been required to be, an act of resistance. One soup, one side, rice, or what had become rice, the grain extended with sweet potato and barley and okara and whatever the week's foraging had added to the pot. The structure of the meal persisted when every element that had filled the structure in peacetime had been replaced by something lesser, and then replaced again by something lesser still. By 1945, in the hardest-hit urban areas, the one soup might be hot water with a piece of kombu and a scrap of salt. The one side might be a few strips of dried sweet potato or a cake of kantan set with vegetable broth. The rice might be more water than grain, more sweet potato than rice, more wish than substance. And yet the structure held. The bowl was set on the table. The chopsticks were placed beside it. The family gathered at the meal hour. If the family was still intact, if the house still had a room to gather in, if the table was still standing. The act of sitting down together to a meal that had the form of a meal, even when its content had been reduced below the threshold of what any of the participants would have recognized as adequate food before the war began, was the daily insistence that the war had not yet taken everything. Japanese philosophers and psychologists who studied the wartime civilian experience in the post-war years returned again and again to the persistence of mealtime structure as one of the primary resilience factors they identified in families and communities that had maintained social cohesion through conditions that destroyed it in others. The structure of the meal was the structure of the family, the family that still ate together at a table, however, reduced the table's contents, was a family that had not yet been disassembled by what the war was doing to everything around it. The meal at number 1 is therefore every meal on this list simultaneously. It is the zosui and the imo gayu and the yomogi mochi and the okara meshi and the acorn porridge and the algae paste and the dried sweet potato strips and the hidden pickles and the content shapes that mimicked what had been lost. It is all of them held within the structure that made them meals rather than merely calories. The structure of people sitting down together or alone in the ruins of together and eating as if the act of eating correctly still meant something. It did mean something. It means something now. The families that maintained the form of the meal through the worst years of the worst war Japan had ever fought did not survive because the form fed them. They survived because the form reminded them every evening that they were the kind of people who sat down to meals rather than the kind that did not, and that being that kind of people was worth every effort that the clay pot on the burner required. These 10 meals kept Japanese families alive during the Pacific War. They are not recipes anyone would choose. They are evidence of what people are capable of when the alternative to creativity is watching the people they love go without. Which of these survival meals surprised you most? Drop your answer in the comments. And if your family carries any memory of this period, a dish, a smell, a story told only once and never repeated because the telling was too close to the thing itself, write it down. The history that lives in those memories is the history that the official records forgot to keep. It belongs to everyone. It is disappearing. And the only people who can save it are the ones who ask for it before it is too late.